Sensational news. A Ukrainian journalist in Paris spoke with and shamed Putin's daughter. Trump and Putin are pleased with the negotiations. The Russian dictator declared that he will seize all of Donbas. This record-breaking Russian operation has lost 20,000 soldiers killed. Gerasimov's nonsense. He claimed that Russian troops have surrounded the Ukrainian armed forces in the Belgorod region. Kremlin intrigues. Putin's negotiator Dmitriev has declared war on Lavrov. Something is brewing. Lukashenko is preparing his family for evacuation from Belarus. Hello, my name is Katerina Nestorenko, and right now let's talk about the main news. But first, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so we don't lose touch with you. Across the vast expanses of YouTube, I'll be honest, I didn't expect this, but our colleagues from TSN found Putin's illegitimate daughter, Elizaveta Rossova, in Paris. And not only did they find her, they actually spoke with her.
How do you feel about your father's politics? Do you support him? Do you support him?
What do I have to do with this?
Well, he is your biological father. At the very absolute least, you could call him right now and simply say, "Dad, please stop shelling the beautiful city of Kiev."
Well, of course.
Well, go ahead, try it.
Well, of course.
They tracked down the child of the Kremlin devil for a long time. And as Dmitry Svetlenko recounts, the first attempt to meet with Luisa Rossova failed, but this time they got lucky.
Rek. A year ago, my colleague Valeria Kovalinskaya conducted her own journalistic investigation and found out where this girl studies in France and where she works. Unfortunately, she was unable to meet the daughter of the Kremlin dictator. Valeria successfully found both male and female students. Valeria diligently found male and female students who had studied extensively with her in the very same academic department, sharing many valuable experiences and insights during their time together. She found her professors who shared what kind of student she was. And even the school principal indirectly confirmed information about Liza Trilou's father. My colleague found people who had worked with Liza, had seen her in various galleries, and told us where to look for this girl. It was thanks to the TSN investigation that we knew where, and most importantly, when to look for our girl in the gallery, in the 20th arrondissement of Paris. Exactly a year later, we decided to try to find her again.
The most interesting thing about this conversation is that Putin's illegitimate daughter, the murderer, did not deny her connection to him. She did not object. And what could she say? Just look at how much they resemble each other. Do
you have any conversations like that in your family? I mean, I don't know, at the dinner table, for example.
I am truly sorry, but please forgive me. I genuinely cannot answer your specific questions at this moment.
Sorry, but I'm in complete shock. Besides the fact that Elizaveta, Putin's pink one, says she's very sorry, but she can't influence the bald one in any way.
It really is a pity that things are happening this way. Unfortunately, I am not responsible for this situation. I'm glad you had the courage to come up to me and talk. But unfortunately...
Well then, call, serve, say something. At least have him stop for today. Stop shelling at least something.
I wish you a good
evening. At least for one day.
It's a pity. All right, evening.
By the way, this isn't the first time she said she's sorry. Well, the fact that she doesn't understand this war is for sure. She wrote about it on Instagram. Then she seemed to delete everything, but it happened. She didn't have security in the usual sense of the word. No one pushed the journalists away or tried to interfere. Well, almost.
People just froze. The men just stood still. And when I said, "Good evening, we're from Ukraine, I have a few questions for Liza," they couldn't think of anything better to do than to step aside and say, "Please, Russians don't abandon their own. Please, Russians don't abandon their own." In the hands of one of these guards, journalists noticed a portable electronic warfare system. That's probably why, during the conversation, the wireless microphone suddenly stopped working. During the conversation with Liza, While talking to Liza, I lost the connection from this microphone. It worked before I spoke to her. It worked afterwards. Right now it's working perfectly fine. But at the moment I was talking to her, it was hissing, crackling, doing all sorts of things. But it didn't work properly. What could that mean? What does that mean? And this should be an interesting question for the French intelligence services, because around Liza, maybe her companions, in fact there was a jammer operating that was blocking the signal from the wireless microphone. In reality, there was a jammer working which was blocking
the signal from the wireless microphone. Sorry, I'm still in shock, so the floor is yours. I'll be waiting for your comments. Reading the comments under previous episodes, I see that many of you are watching us from Kazakhstan, Moldova, Europe, and even the USA. We Ukrainians are very grateful for your support and proud to have such reasonable viewers. Write in the comments under this episode which country you're watching us from and whether people there support our fight against the empire of evil. I always enjoy reading your comments. And meanwhile, we continue. Now, on to the most interesting part. So, as soon as the negotiations in Moscow about the so-called peace plan ended, Trump started making statements. Let me remind you, in Moscow, Whitaker and Kushner spoke with Putin. And Trump described their talks as successful. And according to the observations of the two negotiators, Putin supposedly wants to end the war.
You know, that was their impression. Their impression was that Putin would like to return to normal life. I think he would rather trade with the US than lose thousands of soldiers every week. But their impression was very strong. They would like to make a deal. We'll see what happens.
Interestingly, Putin's negotiators did not speak as enthusiastically about the talks, since there are no compromises. And Ushakov even referred to Whitaker and Kushner simply as these people.
It was agreed that at the level of representatives, aides, and other officials, we will continue contacts with the Americans, in particular with these two people who came to the Kremlin today.
It's clear that the Kremlin is not ready to make compromises. But Trump doesn't see that yet. He says the meeting in Moscow went very well. And now the President of the United States claims that when he told Zelensky that he had no cards, at that time it would have been more advantageous for Ukraine to make a deal. But according to Trump, it was Kiev that supposedly didn't want this. And Trump seems not to understand why not.
You know, when I was in that office, I said, you have no cards. That was the time to make a deal. I think that would have been the best time to settle things, but in their wisdom, they decided not to do it. Now there's a lot going against them. But Putin had a very productive meeting with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. What will come out of this meeting? I can't tell you, because it takes two to tango. You know, Ukraine, I think we worked well with them. They're very satisfied, considering the circumstances.
Peskov, in turn, immediately after the meeting stated that Putin supposedly did not reject the peace plan, saying that such a characterization was incorrect. According to him, for now, they simply exchanged views. That is why, as the Russian side claims, the details of the meeting will not be disclosed.
The details of these meetings will not be made public because these meetings, as you correctly said, and I believe you mentioned this in your question, are working meetings aimed at results, not at outward appearances.
How so? As journalists from The Times write, this is precisely Putin's tactic, to wait until Trump gets tired and starts blaming Ukraine for being unyielding. As noted, Putin has not softened his demand that Ukraine hand over all of its Donetsk and Luhansk regions. There has been no agreement reached regarding NATO membership or European security guarantees for Ukraine. And there has been no agreement on direct negotiations with Zelensky. Zelensky himself is trying to personally present his position to Trump and urge him to increase pressure on Russia, but so far, this has only happened at the representative level. After all, following Putin, Witkoff and Kushner met with the head of the Ukrainian delegation, Rustem Umerov, in Miami for further negotiations. But what is the point of this if Putin wants to continue the war? And what do you think about this? Be sure to write your thoughts in the comments. I'm very interested to hear your opinion. Putin himself also called the meeting with Witkoff and Kushner very useful. At the same time, he openly stated that Russia did not agree with certain points of the US peace proposals on Ukraine. And he emphasized that this is a complicated process. According to Russian media, Putin said in an interview that Russia will seize the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. In any case,
It all comes down to this. Either we will liberate these territories by military means, or the Ukrainian forces will leave these territories and stop fighting there.
the dictator once again reminded that supposedly, even before the start of the full-scale war in Ukraine, Moscow had offered Kyiv to withdraw its troops from Donbas, but allegedly Ukraine preferred to fight.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
With this very phrase, Putin glossed over the fact that he had already sent his troops in earlier, illegally seizing Ukrainian territory and starting to kill civilians as far back as 2014. Putin even had the audacity to remind everyone that supposedly Russia did not recognize the self-proclaimed LNR and DNR, even though it was Russia that created them. As usual, his words are nothing but lies aimed at Trump. And now listen to what Putin said back in 1999 about occupying any territory in Ukraine.
That's absolute nonsense. If we start taking something from someone, then something will definitely be taken from us in return. Or we will lose something ourselves. In any case, if we start such a redistribution in the territories of the former Soviet Union, we will never be able to recover from it. We are
still supported by
Ukraine. There are as many as 400 disputed territories within the Russian Federation alone. 400! I want everyone to know about this. That's the first thing. Secondly, sugar, gas, those are secondary issues. Thirdly, there is, let's say, a field where we can argue. But it's nothing more than an argument. In my view, the main problem is the heavy burden, the imperial legacy of Russia. For some reason, everyone thinks that Russia has remained an empire. And now, those who are applauding, I want you to listen to me carefully. Everyone thinks that Russia is still an empire and treats it as such to this day. But that's long since stopped being the case.
He swore that Russia is not an empire, that he never plans to engage in occupation. A pathological liar who feeds on murder and war. Meanwhile, fighting continues on the front, and Putin is proud of it. The battle for Ukrainian Pokrovsk is one of the fiercest. Part of the city is occupied, while another part remains under Ukrainian control. Russian Federation soldiers described how the occupiers entered Pokrovsk. The footage clearly shows the destruction that Russia brings to any Ukrainian city.
First, of course, our team worked everything out. The vehicle checked everything, looked at what could be done and how. That's why they chose this approach, for us to enter in small groups. And once we had secured our positions, once the sappers had cleared the roads in the areas, we then started bringing equipment into the city. So we entered. This was the first point where we came in, right here in the southern district. Here is building 12, the first entrance. We entered here, fortified our position, cleared this building, then brought in reinforcements and started clearing and checking this entire block. Right here. And what about behind this building? The Dasha community, people entered through it, through these summer houses. There were still leaves on the trees, and then the fog started rolling in here. We gathered our forces and there was a thick fog, so we just boldly moved down the road in that fog.
The enemy published videos from 3 neighborhoods at once, Yuzhny, Lazurny and Solnechny. Of course, in Russia they're claiming that they've captured everything long ago. But Gerasimov clearly needs to brush up on his geography. He reported to Putin that Russian troops are tightening the encirclement around the armed forces of Ukraine at Yakim, Stary Oskol. But there is no river with that name.
the formidable troops, various units, and strategic formations of the powerful Western group of forces have decisively concentrated their primary and significant efforts in the crucial Krasnoliman direction and along the left bank of the river specifically. Stary Oskol regarding the defeat of the encircled group after the capture of Kupiansk.
Most likely they were talking about the Oskol River near Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. But Stary Oskol, a city in Belgorod region, Russian Federation, Putin, with such statements, is himself confident in the capture of these territories. He is sure that in a couple of days, Kupiansk-Uzlovoy will be completely captured.
There are 2,000 buildings and fighting is taking place there. 600 buildings, maybe about 1,000 already. Well, 600 to 650 are in the hands of the Russian army. The advance is ongoing. I think in a few days. We will take this settlement as well, but this is a separate settlement. And besides everything else, let me remind you that on the left bank of the river, it is blocked.
But this clearly shows just how out of touch with reality Putin is. After all, there is fighting going on there and the front line is shifting. It changes every day. But even in losses, Russia has truly set a record. But this record is for the number of casualties. 20,000 Russians have died because Putin is out of touch with reality. And here it's worth showing how Russians successfully launched drones at themselves and finished themselves off.
Go ahead, ready. Fly.
But despite this, the grey zone is expanding. In Donbas, both in the Pokrovsk direction and in the Kostiantynivka direction. This was reported by a Ukrainian soldier with the call sign Mukhnoi.
On the eastern flank, the expansion of the grey zone is also being observed. The Russians are trying to cover our line with a small arc, create pressure from both sides, and thus complicate maneuvering and logistics. Where a few of their scouts showed up, everyone is already down. However, the very fact of their appearance shows that they are probing every gap, testing the flanks, looking for any opportunity to break in and create a bulge in our lines.
Russian propaganda is also actively claiming that the Russians have captured Dobropilya in the Donetsk region. But it was just a sabotage and reconnaissance group, which the Ukrainian military has already driven out, and the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has provided evidence of this. More details about what is happening on the front and around it at this moment are in our report.
Don't say hop until you've jumped over. The Ukrainian proverb that perfectly describes the current situation for the Russian Federation on the Lyman front. Here the occupiers managed to advance a little, which they immediately reported. Z war correspondents. But they are obviously also read by Ukrainian intelligence, thanks to which the SU received operational data that they immediately put to use.
I would like to thank the Russian war correspondent, Timofey Ermakov. He spoke about our positions on his Telegram channel. Thanks to this, the Ukrainians found us and took the flan. They killed.
At the same time, the heaviest fighting on the front traditionally takes place in the Pokrovsk area. A high-ranking NATO official stated that the Russians control 95% of the city. In Ukraine, however, they explain that in the West, grey zones are often attributed to the occupiers, without fully understanding the specifics of the fighting. Therefore, in reality, the situation is better, although still very difficult. Yes.
Today, the Russians control most of Pokrovsk. Yes, today, the so-called grey zone occupies most of the city. Yes, today, the Russians are trying to disrupt our logistics as much as possible, including those of the Mirnograd garrison, since this is a single Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration. However, in any case, even today, despite all the efforts of the Russians, the Pokrovsk defensive operation continues.
At the same time, for several weeks now, Putin has been blindly repeating that Pokrovsk is completely under Russian control. According to Sky News, Russia deliberately announced the capture of Pokrovsk ahead of negotiations with the US, which took place on December 2nd. However, in reality, the situation is quite different. Moreover, the Vostok troop grouping reported that the defense forces are organizing additional logistical routes to supply their units in Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, where intense fighting continues. And in the city itself, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to eliminate Russian occupiers in the urban area. In
the 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Ukrainian Air Assault Forces, they told Reuters that they are holding the northern part of Pokrovsk and conducting assault operations in the southern part, where Russian troops predominate.
Another settlement that remains in the headlines is Kupiansk. Despite daily attempts by the Russians to turn the situation around here, they have not succeeded. The initiative remains with the Ukrainian armed forces, and the clearing of enemy units is already taking place on the outskirts of the city.
At the moment, about 50 to 60% of the city is completely under the control of the defense forces, and about another 20% is a grey zone. As always, the Special Operations Forces units have performed excellently. They played a crucial role at the most critical moment.
Moreover, Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky stated that the Ukrainian armed forces are not only destroying the enemy but also cutting off the occupiers' logistical routes, including those the enemy uses to send in reserve forces.
There are no successes. A clearing operation is underway. And in fact, the blocking of those routes through which the enemy had established infiltration into Kupiansk has already taken place. This matches reality. Because if it were otherwise, we would have seen changes on the map in Kupiansk, but there are no changes there.
Worrying news has been coming from the Zaporizhzhia region lately. Our command admits that the enemy has had some success there. However, the General Staff is making every effort to stabilize the situation. And according to analysts, the pace of the enemy's advance has already been significantly reduced.
Humiliated, which the enemy was counting on entering, right here and now it continues to hold. Some Russian units that previously tried to infiltrate the territory of this populated front were destroyed. And in principle, in the near future, I think we will see that very stabilization of the front in this sector.
In total, over the past day, the enemy tried more than 200 times. to storm the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces. Over 1,200 occupiers were eliminated in these attacks, as well as nearly 50 vehicles and more than a dozen artillery systems destroyed.
I never cease to admire the courage and heroism of Ukrainian soldiers. They hold the front and stand against a huge horde that vastly outnumbers them. That's why I urge you to support the Ukrainian armed forces, and if you can't do so financially, write them words of encouragement in the comments. I know they're watching us. And Lukashenko is preparing to flee Belarus. That's exactly what Belarusian opposition media believe. Lukashenko disappeared right after arriving in Oman. Belarusian media are now keeping quiet about the negotiations, reporting reluctantly, even though they officially announced his visit. And the media in the Persian Gulf country did not report his arrival either. Batka has dropped out of the information space. According to Belarusian opposition media, he may be preparing to evacuate his family from the country. Lukashenko's grip on power currently appears strong, but the dictator still has reasons to be afraid. The appointment of a governor in the Belarusian province by Russian masters could become an issue on the agenda after a theoretically possible truce in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Moreover, the dictator is not getting any younger, and after his death, his family will not be able to hold on to power. In the struggle against the security forces and other factions among officials, a safe haven is needed. And what do you think? Where exactly would Lukashenko flee, and would he flee at all? Be sure to share your opinion in the comments. Kirill Dmitriev has become one of Putin's key negotiators and a thorn in the side of the Russian Federation's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Why has the conflict between Dmitriev and Lavrov started to escalate? Has Lavrov really fallen out of favor with Putin, and could ambition help Dmitriev become one of the main figures in Russia? All the details are in the report.
The one who creates problems for the Kremlin's old guard.
On President Putin's orders, I spent 2 days in the United States. I was received positively, and we had a very frank conversation.
Kirill Dmitriev, head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, has long been nicknamed Putin's negotiator with the US. He is also called one of the architects of those very 28 points of Trump's peace plan. After Trump's new term, Dmitriev's importance to the Kremlin increased sharply, and now he has become one of the key participants in Russian-American contacts and negotiations on resolving the war in Ukraine.
In fact, there is a substantial list of things, a list of steps that need to happen in order for us to truly start interacting better.
As of today, Dmitriev is effectively serving as one of the Kremlin's key diplomatic channels. For Putin, he has become a very close person. It has repeatedly come up that Dmitriev became close to the dictator thanks to family ties with the head of the Kremlin. After all, Dmitriev's wife is a close friend of Putin's daughter, Ekaterina Tikhonova, but it's not just about nepotism. He
is a person who is close to Putin due to certain circumstances. Some family connections, because we remember those stories about wives and daughters. And how did he even get into this circle? On the other hand, it's important to understand that he studied abroad and had established quite close relationships with representatives of the American economic elite, first and foremost.
Good contacts with Steve Witkoff also played into my hands, and now a seemingly beneficial person for the Kremlin has become a thorn in the side of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, namely Sergei Lavrov. After all, a real battle for the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has recently begun. Lavrov, fighter for traditional
diplomacy in international relations.
Dmitriev represents new approaches that include not only diplomatic but also business relations. The media have repeatedly reported on Putin's dissatisfaction with the previously failed negotiations with the Americans. Lavrov was blamed for this. After that, Lavrov virtually disappeared from the public eye. But it was Dmitriev who put US-Russia relations on a new track.
Dmitriev spoke about this directly, saying that this gentleman, Kirill Dmitriev, helped organize everything, helped in fact to establish some kind of relationship between our countries. And one more thing, he's from Ukraine, which in Putin's view is significant. He's the kind of proper Russian who denies the existence of Ukraine as an independent country. And accordingly, this is probably an important point for Putin as well.
Competition has increased, and as Russian media report, Dmitriev decided to advance his career. Further, he even suggested Lavrov's resignation to Putin. Lavrov's. In Kirill Dmitriev's opinion, the foreign ministry is already outdated and ineffective. Traditional diplomacy is archaic. That's why it's time for one of Russia's key diplomats to retire.
This is about the future, because earlier he was talking a bit more about the past.
Lavrov's team, aware of this, ready to put compromising material Dmitriev on Putin's desk. Compromising material on Dmitriev.
Dmitriev goes to America and tells all sorts of things there. It's very unfortunate that he's doing this. We've gathered some information on him. We'll soon pass it on to Vladimir Vladimirovich. After that, Dmitriev should come under investigation. At the very least, he should no longer be allowed to leave Russia. I'm saying this directly so that Dmitriev doesn't get any bolder. Diplomacy is inappropriate in his case, said a source close to Lavrov.
Competition has turned into conflict, and this conflict between Lavrov and Dmitriev has been going on for almost a year now. According to journalists, even Patrushev has raised questions about the new negotiator. He stated that Dmitriev is overstepping his bounds when he makes promises about cooperation between Moscow and Washington, especially in the Arctic region.
Nikolai Platonovich had a conversation with the president. He noted that Dmitriev is certainly a talented negotiator, but he has clearly overstepped his authority.
The relationship between the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry and Putin's special envoy has reached a breaking point. But according to experts, Dmitriev is not interested in Lavrov's position.
I don't think Dmitriev is aiming for the role of foreign minister at all. He has a somewhat different function, and it's important to understand that in the power structure Putin has built, formal positions certainly play a certain role, but it's the informal connections that are the main key factor. In terms of informal connections, Dmitriev has probably even surpassed Lavrov by now, in some respects.
And according to experts, it's unlikely that anyone will remove Lavrov. Besides, Putin values people who have worked with him for years. But the real question is, would anyone dare to remove Putin himself? Russian journalists, citing their own sources, have shared a very interesting detail. Dmitriev is very ambitious and not entirely honest with Putin.
Sergei Viktorovich believes that Dmitriev is not completely honest with the president and is playing his own game with the Americans, hoping to secure a higher position in the future, the source said. He did not specify whether this referred to the post of prime minister, foreign minister, or even president.
The latest negotiations in Moscow have shown just how influential Kirill Dmitriev is in the negotiation process with the Americans right now. And this is a very important part of the history of Russian diplomacy. But will Dmitriev's ambitions be enough to get him there? To the post of president. The question remains open, because for now he is still in a standoff with Sergei Lavrov, whom Dmitriev has clearly sidelined with his new ideas.
French President Emmanuel Macron is visiting Beijing from Wednesday to Friday. And during his trip, he plans to once again ask Xi Jinping to influence Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Will the Celestial Empire go against the Quasi-Empire?
Macron will ask China to put pressure on Putin. This Wednesday, the president of France plans to visit Beijing, and during his trip, he wants to once again ask Xi Jinping to influence Russia to end the war in Ukraine. This was stated by French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot. This current visit to China will be Macron's fourth since he came to power in France.
Russia's economy is currently too heavily dependent on its cooperation with China. The vast majority of the oil that is exported via extensive pipelines mainly goes to Europe, but a significant portion also goes to China. And China consistently buys truly huge volumes of this crucial oil, significantly more than what Europe is able to purchase at present. Let's look at the estimates for the first quarter of this year. In total, it's 51.7%.
The visit of the Chinese foreign minister to Moscow for talks with his Russian counterpart hardly seems coincidental. Interfax claims that the parties are holding consultations on issues of strategic security and military cooperation. Moreover, this is happening on the very same day that U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is meeting with the Kremlin's dictator Vladimir Putin.
China, of course, has its own interests. First of all, China wants to make money and not spend it on Russia. Secondly, as was said, or rather, let's put it correctly, as the South China Morning Post, the Hong Kong newspaper, wrote, that Wang Yi, China's top diplomat, at a meeting with Kaja Kallas, the EU's chief diplomat, said that China does not want the war in Ukraine to end. In other words, China does not want either side to win.
Xi Jinping called for a swift peace in his conversation with US President Donald Trump. Was that a sincere question? It's rhetorical. However, it's not far from the truth that benefits China.
China does not want any progress on the peace track. Accordingly, the capitulation of Ukraine, that is unacceptable to Ukraine, but in essence, it would put an end to this war, a bad end for Ukraine. China, that doesn't suit them.
China creates the appearance of supporting Russia while actually nurturing the idea of how to absorb it.
China understands that Russia's economic problems will lead to difficulties in providing for the country's regions with finances. First and foremost, this will affect the remote regions, the remote atmospheres of the regions. These are regions that are very close to China. And moreover, some of them used to be part of China even before Open Up World. That's why China understands that this problem with financing and the disintegration of Russia, in essence, the collapse of the Soviet Union 2.0, such a breakup of Russia, will lead to China expanding its territory, simply because Tuva and other regions, for example, will remember that they were once part of China. And quite simply, they will want to be under China's umbrella to continue their normal economic activities, or to be more oriented toward Beijing than toward Moscow.
Apart from the issue of Russia losing territory for China, this is also a matter of dividing up political influence in the world, a sphere in which Moscow was dealt a painful blow by the invasion of Ukraine, and which continues to diminish with each year of the war.
Meanwhile, as Ukrainian MP Ole Dunda stated, the Russian language is no longer protected by Ukrainian law. The Verkhovna Rada has removed this language from the text of the European Charter for regional or minority languages. At the same time, all the other languages that were on the list retain their status. However, this has already drawn a response from the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova. She took advantage of the situation and claimed that supposedly, by taking this step, Ukraine is showing that it is not interested in a peaceful resolution.
What is happening with language in Ukraine? It's complete madness. And of course, such steps indicate that Kyiv has no intention of seeking a peaceful resolution. After all, one of the conditions for this should be the abolition of discrimination against the Russian language and Russian-speaking citizens, as well as respect for the rights of all nationalities living in Ukraine. I call on international organizations to give an objective assessment of this decision by the Kyiv regime and to take measures to urge it to fulfill its obligations in the field of human rights.
But for some reason, she forgot that the Ukrainian language is also not protected by the laws of the Russian Federation. Moreover, there is a whole history of oppression and bans on the Ukrainian language in Russia. But it was precisely Russia that started the war, allegedly because of the Russian language and its supposed oppression in Ukraine. It seems from reality itself. It's not just Putin who's out of touch there. How do you like our news? Let us know what we should change to become better. We will definitely take it into account. In the meantime, give this video a like to support what we're doing. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Ukraine Today so you don't miss the next episodes. See you soon.